Second. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pie Before Dinner. This is Dr. Lou, your friendly neighborhood mathematics superhero, coming to you live and direct from the soon-to-be state of D.C. now that we're all Democratic in the House and the Senate. I am here live in studio with a guest and friend of mine to talk about a very important topic, Lisa Betts-Lacroix. I said that right, didn't I? Lisa Betts-Lacroix.
Perfect.
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Always an honor to be with you, and always enjoy having conversations about the diverse subjects that we can get into.
Awesome. We're here to talk about, as you've seen in the title page, folks, we are talking about something near and dear to my own space, ADHD. Beautiful minds, living and thriving with ADHD. And I was telling, before our broadcast earlier got interrupted, we're sorry, we're having some serious internet issues here in the DC area. Before our broadcast got interrupted, I was telling folks, Lisa, how I was, my colleagues called me the beautiful mind, part and parcel because of, they liked watching how my mind worked. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But it was also a cautionary tale as well because of how my mind worked. And so I'm just so glad to have been on this journey to unpack and uncover ADHD. So many of the parents in our audience, in our community, in the communities I network with, talk so much about that ADHD and other disabilities, and other disability labels, and don't know how to navigate. But we've come across you and come across your work on social media, on TikTok. You are a dancer, actor, speaking coach, a phenomenal speaking coach at that, as well as at that. And so I'm so happy. Can you explain just some of the topics you talk about on TikTok and end up with the ADHD, and then we'll continue the conversation?
Perfect. I'd love to. I am primarily a speaking coach, and my speaking skills training is based on my years as a film and television actor. And I also, like you said, I'm a dancer, but I'm an amateur Latin competitive dancer. And it's funny because I got on TikTok, and the two topic areas that I primarily spoke about were artful aging, because I have a whole model around how do we age graciously, and also how do we change the narrative on aging in our culture, and speaking skills based on my background as a film and TV actor. And my speaking skills training is all about empowerment and how do we find the message and tell our story so we can change the world, because that's greatly needed right now. But by some turn of events, one of the TikToks I did about ADHD happened to go viral. And that alerted me to the fact that there are many people who identify with the idea of having an ADHD-like brain, as is the case with me. So that's a little bit of a foundation.
Listen, I've self-diagnosed myself. Whether you're diagnosed or not, right? You can have an ADHD, ADHD-like brain. There are a host of symptoms, and I think out of the 12 formal symptoms, I've clearly ticked like 11 boxes. And the idea of having battled and having, I don't want to say battled in the past, battled with ADHD my entire life and existence will come of no surprise to my friends and my family. So let's just get right into it, because either parents know of themselves struggle with ideas, the adults in this community, or they know of young people. So it impacts adults and children. Lisa, tell us what is it like living with an ADHD-like brain? What are the everyday nuances and challenges that come with living with ADHD?
I think everyone's circumstances are different. And as you know, and some other people may also, ADHD is a name, a label given to a set of characteristics. There's no blood test for it. It's not like you can have a binary answer to whether you are or you aren't ADHD, but rather it's a continuum of it's a set of characteristics that are, as a group, labeled as ADD or ADHD. And most of us are on the continuum somewhere on all those characteristics. So it differs for everyone. But I can tell you, for me, what it's like. For me, my ADHD-like brain is I have a lot of ideas all at once. I don't think in terms of a linear pathway, which I think you mentioned to me also. I don't just think in one straight line, but rather I think in a collective, in a wide rainbow of all things happening at the same time. My brain works really quickly. Sometimes it can barely keep up with my mouth. And luckily, I'm a speaking coach and I've worked on pause and taking my time and articulation, which forces me to slow down. But when I'm not conscious and using my skills, I can, like so many people with ADHD, be trying to catch up with my brain. And as a result, I'm tripping over myself and maybe getting, tongue tied or forget what I'm saying. Or another characteristic that's for me and maybe true for other people is I tend to interrupt people because I'm excited about the conversation. And then maybe you say something that stimulates an idea in my head. And because my brain is going so quickly, I already think I know the end of your sentence and I want to get in and tell you what the next thing is or what I think or add on to what you're thinking. And so that's another characteristic. I start many, many projects all the time. Sometimes I don't finish things. I feel like I put myself through over the years for procrastinating, which I think is, I'd love to leave you to open that up for you because I love what came out in our conversation last night about procrastination.
You're right, Lisa, and I was just looking at, look, you can, if the audience is if you're listening to this and you don't quite understand ADHD, we're not going so deep into ADHD. We're not doctors. If you want a doctor's opinion of what it is, fine, but you can pretty much Google and get a real good sense of how ADHD shows up in the space, right? I mean, it's this idea of sometimes it's a I guess in society I would say, Lisa, would you agree, a kind of the symptoms listed are inattention and impulsivity, and like I said, when I said earlier in the show, I was called hyperactive, and I remember bragging in school about being hyperactive because I didn't know what it was. I was like 6 or 7. I said, "Yeah, my mom said I'm hyperactive." I remember being 9 and being in the office talking to this psychologist and being shown these pictures. What does this picture mean? Or just being taken through these different tests at 8, 9 years old. Meanwhile, I had been accelerated, skipped a grade, and so I was, performing academically at an extremely high level. But this thing, why are you assessing me like this, right? And my mom would later tell me that she wouldn't let them give me medication. Now, this isn't a show about whether or not you should get medication. That's a very personal decision. But I now know, having been a public school administrator, assistant superintendent, director in Bermuda Public Schools, I now know what was happening. We were assessing a young person for some sort of social emotional disability. And it's so interesting. It will come as no surprise to my friends that I've lived my entire life with this I want to call it a battle, but now I realize this is my superpower through at least my interactions with you as well, that I can embrace this thing. And so when you say that you're thinking about all these things at once, I'm saying yes. I have all these thoughts and ideas. I balance all these thoughts and ideas all the time. Right now I have 10 tabs open on this screen. On the other screen there's another 15 and 20. I have 6 or 7 programs, and oftentimes my day is spent going from this to this to this to this to this to this to that. And I battled with the labels and the stigma that came with that. Focus. I was told when I first went to my doctoral program, focus, right? Yeah. It was this battle, this stigma of getting and not prioritizing, not focusing, even procrastinating, right? What do you make of this kind of life? How do we battle through? How do we engage these labels that are lumped upon people like you and myself and children all across the world with the notion of ADHD? How do we battle these labels? What do they
When
mean?
you look at the larger world of what you were earlier saying, disabilities, what have previously been thought of as disabilities or learning disabilities, learning differences, even, I really like the term now neurotypical or neuroatypical or neurodivergent, because I think it more correctly recognizes that a brain that has ADHD or all the various types of maybe learning differences is not typical of the normal way of thinking, but it doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation to it. In fact, some people who are neurodivergent think that that's actually the ideal, and they can't even imagine being neurotypical. That sounds like like NTs. I think they even call them, are like, oh, those are your neurotypicals.
Wow.
So because, and the reason for that is that most people who've gone through the challenge of dealing with the identity and the labels and stuff realize that there is, like you've already referenced, great superpower to the way that we think. And I think you described it so well, which is the way that our brains work when we have ADHD is generally that we are thinking about so many things at the same time. And the skill in that is usually we draw connections between things. So we are very much
Yeah.
pattern seers.
Mm,
We might see
mm,
something in mathematics, for example, and recognize that, wow, that piece, that element of mathematics is so much like this piece of nature that I love. Or,
mm,
wow,
mm.
nature and mathematics have a metaphorical relationship with, and I'm just making this up, but this is the way our brains tend to think and draw the connections between the various subject areas. So I think the challenge at getting there is that we do have this stigma attached to it in the past. And in fact, what I remember when I first realized that I had ADHD, I did what I always do, which is I wrote a Facebook post that said, oh my gosh, I'm 51 years old and I just realized that I have an ADHD like brain. And it was hilarious because some people I know said, oh, that's okay. Don't, they were very kind of conciliatory and reassuring. And then other people were like, you mean you didn't know? Kind of to what you were saying earlier.
When I read out the symptoms, and I call it symptoms, I really we even need to get away from that, but the characteristics.
Characteristics. Yeah.
My friends, it's no surprise. My friends look at me like, well, you're the only one who's been in denial, Lou, and part of it is battling. Look, something's wrong with me, right? And I know that no matter how smart I was and how gifted I was in a space around my thinking, I knew that I was very, very different from a very young age, and not different, neurodivergent, right?
Neurodivergent. Yeah.
Neurodivergent from a very young age, but I could not reconcile it with the society that was around me, the environment, from schooling to every single job that I've had. My mind would move in these directions of looking at problems in multi-pronged ways. In fact, I one of the superpower pieces of this, right, was this idea of if you throw up 5 ideas, I can make sense of them quicker than the average. Like, so quick it scares me, right? And so I end up waiting for people to come around to the thing you've thrown up. And that in that waiting, I would often act out. So in class, when I'm studying mathematics in high school, I'm doing problems, and I'm working. Okay, I'm there, and so I'm getting up. I'm walking out the class. I'm walking around the class, and I would go. If my classmates are looking, I will admit this for the first time on camera. I would go into the locker room and steal food out of their lockers, like steal snacks and stuff that people would bring. I had a problem with snacks, and so, but I was bored, and so
Yeah.
But part of that was I wasn't having a stigma of thinking something's wrong with me, but really now understanding, recasting that I was bored. My
Yes.
mind needed something. I was not challenged, and it was the environment that couldn't handle me.
Yes.
I'm not saying you
Yes.
should go and act out and steal people's lunches,
Right.
but the
But the
environment
thing
could
is, we
not
don't.
handle me.
Yeah, and we don't have in our culture, for the most part, enough of an ability to recognize that sometimes it's the hole that you're trying to fit that square peg into that's the problem. It's not the square peg. And so I think that that's very true, is that for many people who have a freedom of choice, a freedom of lifestyle, either because they're not in typical school or because they work for themselves, they don't have to fit into a typical job. They have a they have a shortcut to actually embracing the superpower that is their ADHD like brain. But when it's a kid, and especially a young boy with maybe a lot of energy that you're trying to fit into that round hole, it can really be perceived as there's something wrong with the kid. And the thing that I want to address on that that's super important for anyone who's thinking, oh, this sounds like me, or maybe I relate to this, is one of the most common experiences for people with ADHD like brains, regardless of whether they're diagnosed or not, is this deep underlying hard to shake sense that there is something wrong with your character, or that you are not living up to your expectations, that if only you could focus, or if only, you set your mind to it, or you stop procrastinating, you could actually do the job like in the way that you feel you're capable of. Very deep.
That's interesting because, and I know, thank you, Georgina, for those words. What's interesting, I just put a link to, if you want some background to what ADHD, what its symptoms are like. We know there are three core, from a medical standpoint, there are three core symptoms, right? Inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. You can go through those, but we're talking about really a lived experience right now from people who are living that. That's what you don't necessarily see in these kinds of gatherings. What, for you who have been labeled neurodivergent, what's it like? What are you going through? How can I best help you? How can I best serve you? How can I alter my space? In fact, a good friend of mine, Dr. Catherine Ye, out of the West Coast, talks about this is how we should approach every single ability, every single disability, right? This idea that we can shift the environment to when Spider-Man comes down, you got to give him some buildings to swing on. Like, Superman comes, you got to give him some room to fly.
Yes.
So it's like, if we could radically rethink our abilities. I put up on the screen here, Lisa, according to CDC, almost 9% of children have been diagnosed with ADHD. That's not the undiagnosed people. The people who fit outside of those conditions many haven't been diagnosed. But then when we look at adults, 8% of 8% of black 8% of adults, right? That's 1 out of 12. And then when we look at black children, for so long, white children were diagnosed at higher rates. But with access to, I would propose with access to medical, more formal diagnostic systems, now we're seeing such a high rate above the population, 14.5%. That's 1 out of every 7. And it's what I'm trying to get at is this is a state of affairs that impacts my communities so much more, right? And I meet so many families, Lisa, who are, when they get to this point that my child may have ADHD or not, one, they get bogged down with, do I get a diagnosis? Two, they get bogged down with, do I get medication? But they always, almost certainly get stopped by this idea of, what can they do? Is this a superpower? And I don't see people thinking like that. What do you think would happen if people thought more like that?
You mean more like seeing it as a characteristic of the kid itself rather than a problem?
Yeah. And not just a characteristic, but a launch pad.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'd reference.
Vision.
What I would bring into the conversation is what last night we had a conversation on Clubhouse with a few other people. And I think one of the really important points that was made, and very powerful, is that so many times we see the idea of both in ourselves and in maybe our children or the people that we're supporting, the idea of being procrastinators as being a bad thing, as being a problem, as being something you need to fix or get over.
Yes,
but
right.
what if we thought about procrastination as a signal? What do we thought about when we procrastinate on something? That's information about that there's something wrong with the environment, or that's a sign that the activity itself is maybe not where we should be putting our attention. It's different framing. Excuse me.
I certainly agree, because when I procrastinate, it is a signal. It's a signal that something emotional in the space. There's some block. There's some emotional block. It might be if I'm procrastinating about my writing, or some tasks that I have, I'm putting them off. I could have the entire day free, right? And I procrastinate, and I realize that it's not even just a writer's block for me. It's not even just it's something really. I don't know how you feel about this, but I found that it's very serious. Actually, it's a serious emotional block that I have not addressed as to my feelings on. Uh, I can't even explain it. Does that make
Yeah.
sort of sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I can pick up on that. Absolutely 100%. And that is that if there's something that I'm procrastinating on, then chances are, I mean, you're going to, the counterpoint to that, right? And here's my ADHD brain in action. I'm going to tell you something. And at the same time, I
And then the
have the idea
counterpoint.
of the counterpoint that I want to make sure you get the nuance of the first point, but then there's the other point that needs to also be addressed, right? This the
Yeah.
parenthetical conversation. So there's the
Lisa, Lisa, I get that. People, I want to slow that down because people don't understand what Lisa has just shared with you is a characteristic of the ADHD-like brain that I feel. It's some people think of it as like talking in circles or thinking in circles, but it's you're thinking about the point and the counterpoint and the feedback to the point and the counterpoint and the what if you're going what if and imaginatory all in the same space, right? And the average human being, the neurotypical human being,
yes.
can't get that with our storylines.
Yes. And so I think this goes to the question that you mentioned before. If we recognize that that's the way our brain is working, and this is why when I realized I have an ADHD like brain, it actually transformed my life. Because before I realized that not everyone thinks that way, I thought there was a problem with me that then I was talking in circles and I couldn't. And then what's typical is you talk in circles and you talk in circles, and then you kind of get self-conscious, like, why am I doing that? And I'm not making any sense. And
Yes.
then why am I
Thank you.
going on? And you feel like you didn't really
Yes.
say anything. If you actually recognize that's what's happening, then you can mitigate it, you can acknowledge it, you can moderate, you can be like, oh yeah, I can say right now, I'm saying the main point, and now I hear the parenthetical point happening in my brain. So here's this piece.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so I think the self-awareness about it gives so much power.
Yeah, I want to write that down, Lisa. I think you said that yesterday we had a clubhouse pre-show, and I think you said that. I want to name that because that itself, if this thing is a superpower, and parents, teachers, if you're listening, if you have people in your life, if these neurodivergent
Divergent.
divergent identities, self awareness is big, right? And in fact, in social emotional learning, that's a big space.
Starting
I
point.
don't know, but I don't know if people who promote SEL talk about it in terms of learning it, being self aware of this superpower. It's being self aware of something, but what you're saying is being self aware that I have this superpower and self aware this is what I am currently doing. For me, to navigate that, I have to, and it looks like sometimes if you watch some of the tape and you watch me, you'll see me looking up and looking and looking. Um, I'm actually doing what you're saying. I'm taking note. Okay, that's a counterpoint. That's a point. That's the objection to the counterpoint. That's the point I just made that I just don't like, and I've just changed the point. And so I have to. I'm looking out into a space where I'm physically in my mind. There's a very real space that I'm looking to, that helps me make sense of stuff. But it must look really crazy on camera to some folks.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I speak about pause so much. Because for me, pause is one of the speaking skills that I teach, but it also is very powerful for people with ADHD like brains. And that is, it allows us to recognize all of the places where I'm telling you about something. And I have, like you said, all the counterpoints you named. There's the counterpoint, and then there's the example, and then there's the, the metaphor for it, and there, all the different pieces. Then if I pause, I actually have a bit of a chance once I start to trust myself and the quiet and the moments that when I stop, I can very quickly, because I now know that I have all these different parts of my thinking, and in that pause, decide, now I'm going to talk about the metaphor, or here's the central point. Now I'm going to talk about the counterpoint. And so the power of pause really is, for an ADHD like brain, the ability to have a split second for deciding which part of the story I'm going to speak next.
And I see you've done it like 3 or 4 times just now in the last 30 seconds. Audience, did you pick up on that? And I felt my mood changing. It is so therapeutic because um, my brain races. It's the thoughts, the power of the thoughts, and that the pause, like you just said, is it's so therapeutic.
I'm so glad you mentioned that and catch that and identify that and feel that, because for me, that's what I'm so most excited about right now, is the power of the speaking skill itself to give us an experience and a shift in our nervous system state, right? Which so many of us are living activated nervous systems all the time. But then you add to that the excitement and the creativity of an ADHD like brain, and the experience can be, it can be positive. You and we can get talking and we can get in our ADHD like excitement and creativity. And I get what you're saying and you get what I'm saying. But then to have the choice to consciously use pause while we are talking
I'm trying
to
it out.
shift
Yeah.
the emotional energy is, I think, hugely empowering for us.
What I like about that is that it allows people to, and not just triggering for me emotionally, but it allows me to connect to my audience. It's a trigger for the audience and allows us to to exercise empathy. So what happens when I pause is I breathe. What happens when I pause is I slow down my thought process just a bit. What happens when I
Yes.
pause is that I start to think of the other person
Yes.
and their own experience, but also I start to feel, I feel. So
Connected.
it's like you allow your feelings to catch up with your the brain, the speed of your mind, your intellect. So I love that idea of pausing. You speak about this in terms of speaking, so that might be a very good way of big of sorry, engaging ADHD. I speak, and you talked about earlier about speaking so fast, and you sorry speaking so fast, and your thoughts racing, and they haven't caught up with your speech, or the opposite way around. Right, your speech not catching up
Yeah.
with your thoughts.
Yeah. So I'm so excited to hear you say that, because you just articulated that piece that I teach in such a perfect way. And you
Mm-hmm.
illustrated it at the same time. So in a way, it's like our nervous systems are aligning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that you're going to experience this when you're teaching, or you do experience this when you're teaching, is that when you sink into, and what I say is that when you pause, it gives you the opportunity to connect with yourself,
Mm-hmm.
your idea,
Mm-hmm.
and your audience.
I like that.
All of those. And you articulated that exactly so perfectly. It's connection,
Yeah.
connection with self,
Mm-hmm.
connection with the thought, connection with the audience. It's all about the possibility of slowing ourselves
Yeah.
down so that we can actually have that connection. Now, the interesting thing is that when I first started teaching pause, I thought that it was a technique for speaking only. And it was often heard as, well, I just need to have like quiet. And then people would say, but I don't feel comfortable being quiet, because it's not about empty space. A pause is not about
Mm-mm.
nothingness. It's not about
No,
being quiet and
no.
waiting for the time to go by. No, it's about that connection that you just described so perfectly.
And quiet is torture for an ADHD mind. It is torture. Like just
But
torture me right
connection
now.
is not. Connection for a
Connection is
human
not.
being is not.
Because it challenges us to keep connecting. I want to talk about some more because in pause, it's not just the speaking. You know what I noticed it as you were talking. Sometimes when um, as I speak in different audiences, but when I sing on my praise team. So when I get up to sing, my best moments singing and leading in the praise team is when I operate in the pause, and the pause helps me to reset in the spirit and the spiritual moment. So music plays a part in that as well. Even just listening to music in the bathroom, it's just this music helps me as well to align my spirit with my mind space, my intellect space as well. So it's just
Okay, then in that case, I love that. And you just articulated something that I don't usually talk so much in terms of spirit. I feel it that way. But so
mm-hmm,
let's say that the pause allows for intimacy and connection with the self, the
Mm.
thought, the other, and spirit.
Oh, I like that. Somebody write that down in the chat. Write that down in the chat for us, and we'll put it up on the screen.
Because that's the other piece, Lou, that I'm recently getting as I'm processing myself in my own personal life. I'm processing about the idea of where does intimacy in my own life is challenged for me, just for things that I'm dealing with in terms of processing my childhood. And I've gone through a divorce not so long ago, and I'm processing intimacy. And that's the thing that I'm realizing. This is the other layer, is that this moment
Yeah.
of pause, this moment of taking the time as we are speaking or being is so much about intimacy, right? Intimacy with the self, intimacy with the situation, intimacy with spirit, intimacy with the other.
I didn't expect this conversation to go in that direction, but you're right, because I've I've only opened up. Some people listening to this will never know my own space, my own challenges with abuse, physical and sexual abuse, and so it's a big space for me as well, right? Because we know, as an intellect, we know that um, sometimes trauma can de- de- mess with the development of the brain, right? And we experience trauma, and it messes up with our ability to process intimacy, to process deep connections, particularly if you're young. I mean, if you what ages of 6 to 9, if you experience these traumatic spaces, it can interfere with how you carry out life relationships in terms of impulsivity and hyperactivity, all of that stuff, right? And so the antidote to this, one of the antidotes to this in living to is therapy, and pause is a therapeutic moment. But for most of my teachers listening to this, and I'm not talking about those, for most of my teachers listening to this, we're not, name one class that you've ever been taught around a therapeutic approach to to mathematics, to this idea of pause in mathematics, of pausing around ideas. We flood people's brains with ideas in mathematics, right? We don't never think about pausing in the moment, connecting in the moment, the human spirit, the humanizing of the moment. But so we're asking parents and teachers to think about something they've never themselves experienced or done or been trained to do.
And look
That's
at what a
that's just
metaphor, right? Look at what a metaphor this is. Like, this is so recursive, so metaphorical. Like, you just basically illustrated exactly what we were speaking about before, which is our conversation has gone in this direction, and we're seeing the layers of, oh, we're talking about intimacy, but how does this relate to teaching? How does having pause and connection with self relate to mathematics? I mean, this is exactly the way an ADHD brain works when it's free and embraced and celebrated, is it has the ability to make these connections that you don't necessarily expect.
yeah. And let me bring up this point, because black communities have always talked about the idea of you can't teach us until we have a relationship with you. And I can understand now why that means something. Because intimacy, relationships mean intimacy. Intimacy between the knowledge bearer and the knowledge knower, knowledge knower, and even the knowledge to be known, right? There's a dance, an intricate dance. And so that intimacy. I want to bring up another, I guess, way to engage ADHD, a method of engaging, unlocking this superpower. We talked about intimacy. Sorry, and we talked about the power of pause. We talked about being self-aware. I want to talk about challenge too, right? Because one of the things we have to be very cognizant of, and I'll just write that up here on the screen here. One of the things we have to be cognizant of is that people, our minds need challenge, and that's okay, and that's okay. It's okay. I just need you to sit with this. Your son, your daughter, you need to be challenged intellectually, spiritually, socially, physically challenged. And so many people will know that on some of my monikers in my username in Instagram, for example, or some of my pictures on Facebook, that I mountain bike. And I had to realize why I loved mountain biking, because it is so mentally challenging for me. Meaning, it's not just I can't do treadmills, I can't do stationary bikes. I die. I die a slow death on a stationary bike. And but if you put me on the trails on a mountain bike, I have to think about so many things at once. I get a real hit. I balance. I have to balance my body weight. I have to put my front wheel somewhere. I have to hold on. I have to not squeeze the brakes so hard. I have to do all sorts of stuff. When do I put my seat up and down? What's my wheel size? There's so many things to think about. All at the same time, I'm getting tired. So my brain is getting a good workout, right, where it's getting challenged and exercise at the same time, and I get these my hormone levels go off the charts. This impact, this um, breeze that I get inside my mind. It's so helpful. So I get it why people who go through and suffer not suffer but experience neuro uh, divergent spaces need the challenge.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this before, but I think that is very similar to my experience with dance. Dance has the same element. You have to be thinking about the technical aspects of how you're moving your body. You have to be combining that with connection with a partner. You're integrating music. There's choreography. Like there's so many pieces, and so it totally makes sense to me. But I think the overarching point that you're making is really important for people to hear, even if they're not mountain bikers or dancers, which is that people in general for sure need challenge, but an ADHD like brain really needs challenge. In fact, it's so dependent on the dopamine that comes from a challenge, a challenging environment and being stimulated. That's why we create, why we have that deep need, and why Ed Hollowell, the guy who wrote Driven to Distraction, he says that you need to find. How does he? I should have identified what it is. I think he says you need to find something that's the right kind of hard. Like you have to have
Yes,
something
thank
that is
you,
difficult,
thank
but
you.
it has to be the right kind of hard. And what I would say to those of you who are educators, who I guess are a number of people, although I see Georgina says that she is a therapist, but for the teaching thing, I don't know if you know the idea of the zone of proximal development. Do you know this concept?
Yes,
Yeah. So
reconstructivism. Yes,
zone of proximal development for people.
Vygotsky,
All
Vygotsky.
right.
Yes.
Zone of proximal development, for people who don't know what that is the level of challenge that is exactly right for a learner to have enough of a challenge, like as Lou was talking about, as you were talking about, Lou, that it's difficult, that you have that challenge, just like mountain biking or I have to bring all the pieces together, but that it's stimulating, but it's not. So it's not so hard that it pushes you over the edge where you're flooded. And it's not so easy that you don't have the challenge. The zone of proximal development is that perfect place where the challenge is exactly the right kind of hard so that the stimulation and the dopamine experience happens. And that's where we learn deeply.
And I'll add something to that and link it back to our earlier conversation. That right kind of challenge cannot just be if you're a teacher academic. So
Right.
if you're think about mathematics, if you're just thinking about that challenge, this is what we're taught. We are taught that the challenge is simply in the mathematical concept. But no, when the child with ADHD, the human being needs to be connected to you intimately in extend that challenge into the cultural and the social. Ask them questions that begin to challenge them to think about themselves. We call that in my space culturally relevant teaching. And that's a weird thing to add to the space. Yes, Georgina saying still a math teacher, always. Yeah. What I
But you
said
also brought something else. It can't just be in the head. There has to be a body
no,
element. And that's why I
that's right.
think kids with ADHD have this experience. The ones that are identified are the ones that are in their bodies and intuitively doing what they need to do, which is run around and move things and have impact. Interestingly, the highest, the population that is the most underdiagnosed is adult women who they've grown up, they've aged up, and they've not been identified because they have the mental hyperactivity and ADHD symptoms, but they haven't necessarily expressed it they're not as inclined
Yeah.
to or like driven to express it in their
Yeah.
bodies.
And that's led us to think about ADHD in terms of boys, really, in a way that promotes patriarchy, right? Because women in our society are not often allowed, let's say by societal norms, to act out, right? So there's more pressure for them to conform physically. I'm just saying physically. In class, a boy gets up and jumps around and fidgets. It might even be seen as more acceptable, right? And whereas there's real serious pressures for girls not to act like that. In fact, one of my colleagues was talking about the idea of how undiagnosed and invisible it looks uh, visible it appears in communities, particularly with black girls. So it's something we have to think about as well. Um, Listen, we've talked about a few things. We've talked about what it's like to live with ADHD. There are hosts of symptoms. If you have any of these kinds of things that you think about in terms of inattention and difficulty paying attention to tasks, for example, organizing, distracted, forgetful in your daily activities. Well, I go through these things again. That seems like me. Loses things, necessary tools, wallets, keys. I go to my sister's house and she says, before I leave, I'm a grown man. I'm the oldest in the house, a grown man. Okay, do you have your keys? Do you have your wallet? Do you have your your glasses? And I just sulk. Yes, I check. But I literally, Lisa, have to pat my. I have to do a check. Pat my butt to see my wallet's there.
Yeah.
My key. I have to do a whole physical thing, which seems like it seems so awkward. But this is what people live as they navigate. So we've talked about that. We've talked about ways to thrive and to think about thriving, and we've brought up some points around being self-aware. We've talked about power of pause. I love that, Lisa. I love that strategy. We've talked about intimacy, and we've talked about the challenge. Finding the. I love, and I shared the book with the audience as well. The book was Driven to Distraction. But finding the right kind of hard. I like that that's an article title. Can I use that? That's a
Yeah.
title. Find the right kind of hard for mathematics. I'm going to use it for math something.
I love
But
it.
I think that's a real good set of tools for parents and teachers and people to unlock. Before we leave, is there anything else, any other resources you want to point people towards who are beginning this journey of trying to navigate ADHD and unlock their own superpowers within?
One of the most powerful ones for me was a podcast called Faster Than Normal. I found it was really great for me in terms of shifting my perspective on ADHD, from the idea of it being a liability to being a gift. And there are a couple of really good TED Talks about it that also talk about the same thing, about young people telling their stories of embracing it and making a difference. I guess the one thing I'd say is just question. If you're thinking that this may apply to you, just be careful that you don't go down that route that's so typical in our culture of turning it into a diagnosis, even needing it to be a diagnosis. That's why I always say I have an ADHD-like brain, because I don't claim being ADHD or having ADHD. I just say I relate to the characteristics. And as someone who relates to the characteristics, I can therefore find ways to mitigate them or
Yeah.
accept them or celebrate them and use them.
Yes. You take back the power too, right? You
Yeah.
take back the power. I like that. I like that. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone. Lisa, how can we contact you? How can people connect with you daily? Where can they see you? I see you every day. You come up on my phone on my screen. But let's tell the audience how they can connect with you and see you and hear your ideas.
Honestly, my favorite way to connect with people is definitely TikTok. That's my primary platform that I'm really enjoying right now. I'm Lisa_Lacroix on TikTok. More recently, being on Clubhouse is pretty interesting. I think it's going to be a social media platform of the future. I have the same username there. And then I have a podcast called Super Space Power Space You, Superpower You podcast. And I actually have been wanting to do an episode around these topics. So I may even just repurpose some of this conversation that we're having into an
No,
episode and
definitely. You
reiterate
should. You
some of the
should.
things. Yeah.
If you need a real life mathematics superhero who himself works and navigates the the neurodivergent space, just let me know. It was
Yeah.
great
Maybe we
having
can
you.
have it again on my platform.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. We appreciate you. I'm sorry, I forgot to say goodbye. Audience, thank you. You've been listening to Pie Before Dinner. Guess what? This is our first show under 45 minutes. Woohoo! Way to go, way to celebrate. Thank you for being so patient. Tune in to Pie Before Dinner. Please share this to your profile because others can look at it in their own time. Also go to our site, piebeforedinner.com facebook.com/live. Real special broadcast coming up in 2 weeks, Black History Month. We have a slate of 4 really powerful episodes around STEM, mathematics, and Black history. Look forward to seeing you. Thanks, Lisa. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening.